I know people who have had to leave their homes and move physically because of harassment that started online and moved offline. So, on the one hand, if you have the opportunity to say something and push back, that's great. On the other hand, we have to give grace to people who are in precarious situations, who could lose access to protections or who could be physically endangered as a result.
That was Ari Waldman, a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, an expert in how online spaces are built and regulated. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. Online harassment doesn't always stay online. Sometimes it turns into real-life danger. It might begin with rude comments, but it can quickly escalate into doxing threats or targeted campaigns that threaten someone's home, workplace, or even physical safety. For marginalized communities, this kind of harassment can be especially relentless, adding more layers of risk to what's already a vulnerable situation. Still, there are ways we can push back, from stepping up our own security practices to rallying community support when things feel unsafe. But how did we get to a point where these online platforms seem almost designed to amplify hate? And why do so many people, particularly those already at risk, end up as the primary targets? To understand how we got here and what can be done, I sat down with Ari Waldman. He spent years researching how online spaces are built and regulated and why those structures so often fail the people who need protection the most. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team with a quick health update. Flu, RSV, COVID, and stomach viruses are creating an epidemic, making public spaces, including schools, virus hotspots. Watch for norovirus symptoms like vomiting, RSV's sneezing and congestion, and the flu's high fevers and fatigue. Hydration, rest, and staying home when sick help keep families healthy. Protect your community. Wash your hands, clean surfaces, and keep up with vaccines. Need more info? Email hello@epicenter-nyc.com or text 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Ari Waldman.
So I started researching questions of online safety, particularly the harassment of queer kids online already probably 10 years ago. It's how I started my academic career. It was actually the application that I put in for my PhD. But I have been looking at the impact or the role of technology as it affects queer people from a number of different angles. One of them is use of technology to harass, which includes image-based sexual abuse and videos, but also surveillance and spying and forced outing, and particularly its impact on queer or LGBTQ young people, not just in terms of suicides or suicidal ideation or particular harm, but also as a tool of marginalization and silencing.
Could you speak a little bit about, since you started looking into this topic, how you would say the landscape of that has changed?
Well, in some ways it is better, and in some ways we are right back to where we started. It's better, and unquestionably so, because people are aware of these problems. But 15 years ago, cyberbullying was not a word that a lot of people knew, and now at least people understand that the problem exists, and that's important. People also now understand the problem is real. It used to be the case that people would just dismiss it by saying, "Oh, sticks and stones," or "just close your computer," and we know that that is not only victim blaming, but also so dismissive. And we also have laws on the books. Thanks to the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, its president, Marianne Franks, who's a professor at GW. We have a lot of non-consensual pornography laws on the books in the States. We have active discussions about image-based sexual abuse in Congress. Not all those laws are amazing. Some of them have lots of loopholes and won't actually be super effective, but at least it's part of the discourse. There are many ways in which we have not progressed or regressed. So digital social life, particularly for queer people, is a rough road because there are not only now because social media platforms have now regressed in their rules, allowing all sorts of hate speech to be directed at queer people just because of who they are, but also because the rules and the designs of these systems are not built for queer people. They are oriented around engagement, wide engagement, preferences given to what advertisers want, and the perceptions of what is normal or expected that is based on what a small group of people think. So when you have either majoritarian or a rule that tries to please the most people most of the time, anyone who has cultural differences or is marginalized from most people most of the time, they're going to be erased or their rules are going to harm them. And that's what we're seeing with content moderation with respect to queer content. So you have people who are just trying to share, for example, trans content creators trying to share information about top surgery, or they're trying to share, drag queens trying to share makeup tips. And these innocuous or public health beneficial pieces are being banned or restricted simply because platform rules associate anything queer with being sexual. And that's not the case, right? There are lots of ways in which this kind of queer content is over censored. But at the same time, there's also harassment of queer people and dissident views online, which contributes again to more silencing. So it's this kind of two-step process. Content from marginalized group is censored, but content from majority groups and behavior from majority groups is not censored, all contributing to silencing of the marginalized.
In terms of what's been happening more recently, has it gotten worse in part due to certain policies around online expression that you think have made it worse?
It's definitely gotten worse, but also the things that have been happening are also just more upfront. It's gotten worse in the sense that there are things you can say and do online that you ostensibly couldn't do before, although the extent to which that was enforced was always up in the air. So you have social media turning into what X is now, which is just a cesspool of hate and harassment, anti-Semitism and racism and everything, because that's what the owner of the platform wants. And that's his version of free speech, except when you criticize him, right? So it's free speech for you, for me, but not for thee. So things have definitely gotten worse online, and things have also gotten worse for queer people offline.
In this landscape, what can people do to protect their personal information when they are using social media platforms and maybe are commenting on things that are deemed trigger content?
There are a couple of angles there, right? There's digital behavior and there's organizational behavior. There's what we do with each other, and there's also resistance generally to an emerging coup and emerging destruction of democratic institutions. And there are lots of things that we can do, right? If people are concerned about their information being shared on social media, or their people are concerned that a company has access to their information because they use their communication platforms, well, then use Signal, right? There are lots of things that don't require us to use the platforms that we find vile. However, some people would argue that it's important for dissident voices to stay on X in order to make sure that people who are listening see the truth as opposed to the misinformation tinged version.
I'd like to pause our conversation for a moment to share a clip from a separate interview I did with Jessica Malati Rivera, an infectious disease epidemiologist and science communicator who's also experienced serious online harassment, especially after speaking out against vaccine misinformation. Here's what she had to say.
The role that I play and the visibility that I have comes at a great cost. So I'm quite familiar with being targeted and being harassed. I can think of a very specific scenario in which some fellow scientists co-authored a letter to Spotify in response to Joe Rogan having Robert Malone on his podcast, in which they spoke for 3 hours, spreading all kinds of misinformation about mRNA and mRNA vaccines and COVID and all that stuff. And the request was really specific. It was, can you put a warning that says, hey, this should not be perceived as medical advice. Please speak to your provider or go to these sources for more information about, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, et cetera, something like that. It led to one of the darkest times in my life. I got a call from the FBI. They said that my name and my children's names were on dark websites. I was advised to leave my home for a few days. And that was a turning point for me. That radicalized me a bit in the fact that, yes, many times there are keyboard warriors who are braver on the computer than they are in real life. But there are people there who are looking for you online and who will target you for what you post and target you for who you are. And I think that having good digital hygiene should be on everybody's top priority list. I have massively scaled back from posting about my children for their own privacy and for my protection as well, and for their protection. On talking about sensitive subjects, I'm very aware that I draw attention to myself when I talk about controversial topics that shouldn't be controversial, like certain things that are happening related to wars overseas or human rights violations or abortion rights or even vaccines. And I think in the context of today's political climate, I would say to calculate your risk in that sense, right? To have a risk budget for your digital presence. If it is not going to be either personally or mutually beneficial to you and your audience to share something online, I would say don't do it. I have a unique role in that I'm a public educator. So I bear a little bit of a responsibility to continue to post about these issues despite the risk that it comes with. But I have certain parameters now to protect myself. But the average person who may have a target on them because they are in a vulnerable population, I would say to take a beat and to avoid unnecessary eyes on you, because I think there are people who are conducting witch hunts and trying to target people even more.
Now back to my conversation with Ari Waldman, keeping Jessica's risk budget approach in mind.
So that's smart. And she is in a position to be able to do that. She's a high information user. She knows the risks. She also is self-aware about the benefits and how to navigate them. People ask me this all the time. What would you tell your average non-expert to do about going online? And I always have, and I have the same responses. So, one, every online interaction on platforms that are unsafe, and most platforms are unsafe because they're not designed for safety. They're designed for engagement and money, right? Most engagements online are going to create risk. And if you want to take that risk, that's fine. But some people are in a better privileged position to be able to do that than others. So engage in that kind of risk assessment. Are you willing to accept the possibility that you could be doxxed if you say I have dissident views, or if you say something, or if you're going to be hounded out or the subject of a tagging mob to silence you, right? Are you willing and able to withstand that? And some people are, and some people aren't. Like I know people who have had to leave their homes and move physically because of harassment that started online and moved offline. So there's that. The second thing is that we shouldn't have to make that calculus every time we engage online. And that is the point, though. The point is they want us to have to go through that process. Because if we do, a lot of us are going to just back off and then we're silent. So on the one hand, if you have the opportunity to say something and push back, that's great. On the other hand, we have to give grace to people who are in precarious situations, who could lose access to protections or who could be physically endangered as a result.
For individuals that do become victims of online harassment, especially queer folks and especially trans folks in this moment, do you have any suggestions on what steps they should take once they realize they're being targeted?
Well, they're still reporting practices or tools on these platforms. Whether they're going to be enforced or not, you never know. They need to protect themselves by ensuring that they don't give away information personally that could identify where they live. Although, we have people in the government now who have access to our social security numbers and our addresses and our financial information. So that's at risk. But also, there is a limit that we should engage. if given a world where all of the onus is on us and the onus is on the victim, there's a point at which you have to shut off. So one time years ago, I wrote an op-ed connecting Gamergate culture with Trump culture, the linear path from criticizing or harassing women online as part of gamer communities and this kind of toxically masculine, although nerdy, toxically masculine world, and the world that is represented by the current president's voice. And that is a short step from one to the other. So after I did that and I started getting homophobic and anti-Semitic harassment online, right, you have to shut down. You have to close your tweets and or whatever, deny access and just depart from it. I think that's a self-preservation mode. There's also being public about it, right? It's not just about reporting what happened, it's also telling the world what happened, because these things happen more often than everyone realizes. And if we all spoke up about it, again, that's a matter of privilege. So I hesitate to answer any of these questions so specifically and clearly because it's not a rule that everyone can follow. Only some people have the power and the opportunity to do something to protect themselves.
If someone is being targeted online and does choose to report it, where should they be reporting it to?
Well, there are reporting tools online for the platform, but also if the harassment is serious enough, you should go to law enforcement. Right? Depending upon where you are, law enforcement may be trained to deal with the problem. Oftentimes they're not, but at a minimum, but you should try to file a report if someone threatens you both online and in the physical world. And there are attorneys you can also reach out to. There's Carrie Goldberg in Brooklyn. Reach out to the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, again, an organization I mentioned earlier. I'm on the board of the organization, but it is there with a hotline, and you can find it online. This Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, CCRI. Go call the hotline. Queer people should call the Trevor Project, when things that happen and cause harm. Make sure there are other people that know what is going on, whether it's to protect yourself and your mental health or to tell people, right, and make it known that this is happening.
Lastly, if you didn't already mention it, what's the most common misconception you get in your work on online safety?
That it's not serious, that it's just sticks and stones, and that all you need to do is just shut off your computer and that solves the problem. And of course, that's not the case, particularly for marginalized groups. A lot of it is going to be connected to physical harassment. And even when it isn't, even when it's just image-based sexual abuse, some people are going to send those pictures to your bosses and they're going to ruin your lives. Some people have had to change their name, legally change their name to get away from all of the hits on Google that shows pornography about themselves. And deepfakes are just going to make that even easier to do. So it is serious. And it's more serious for the more precarious among us. And policymakers and individuals need to take it more seriously.
As we know, online harassment is far more than a digital nuisance. It can have real-world consequences, especially for those already vulnerable. But we've also seen that there are tangible steps we can each take towards greater safety and support. If you're looking for more specific tips on protecting yourself, everything from tightening privacy settings to managing risk, check out our full story at epicenter-nyc.com, where we've laid out 4 key ways to protect yourself online. We've linked to it in our show notes. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with a friend. We'd also love to hear from you. Leave us a review or reach out to us at hello@epicenter-nyc.com. That's all for today. Thanks for listening and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.